Hey, what's up guys? In this video I'll be showing some of the instructive moments from my recent tournament, the 2020 Golden State Open. This was an open tournament held in the Bay Area in California just this past weekend, and I did pretty reasonably. I don't want to go over into um, what happened in every game and every detail, but I just want to highlight some of the more interesting moments that took place for me during the event. Before we get into the chess, I want to show you guys the final standings of the tournament. As you can see, first place was won by Grandmaster Vladimir Belarus with clear 6 points out of 7. Then there were two players tied with fifth and a half, GM Rambaldi and Jack Zhu, who is surprisingly untitled, but I believe he's around international master strength. I'm sure his FIDE rating is somewhere around 2400 or so. And then there were a couple of players tied for fourth place with 5 points out of 7. I was one of them here, and we ended up taking down $200 each. So that covered the entry fee for me and some of the travel expenses, and that was about it. But okay, it's still nice not to go home with nothing. My own tournament was pretty solid. Taking a look here, I won the first round. I was playing the 3-day section, which meant that the first two rounds were game 60. I won the first round. I then drew the second round against National Master here, Pranav Nagarajan, who ended up having quite a decent event himself. He was first under 2300, and I can definitely tell. He played very well in the game that we played. And then I took a bye in round 3 because that was going to be the third round on the first day, and that was just too much for me, so I decided to take a bye. I then drew another game against another junior, Adrian Kondakov, in round 4. I was then able to kind of improve with 2 wins in a row. I played a lot of juniors in this tournament. Both of my next opponents were also kids. Number 20, Vyom Vidyarthi, and number 16, Aryan Deshpande. All of these kids, by the way, their USCF ratings are probably underrated, and their FIDE ratings are even more so. Some of these players have FIDE ratings that are like 18, 1900, even though their strength is, of course, much higher. And in the final round, I finally got to play up, and I managed to draw against Grandmaster Andres Stukopin, which was a pretty tough game. Okay, so going into the games, this first round here, I was playing against Shaketh Sivakumar, who is another kid, talented junior. I actually lost to Shaketh in the first round of the 2019 U.S. Amateur Team West. I covered that game on this channel previously. That was kind of a shock game because I ended up blundering in the middle game. He caught me and he just won very quickly. In this game, Black's last move here was the move e5, and Black had been under a little bit of pressure so far, so now he's kind of trying to break out. I ended up playing the move knight to d3 here, just trying to completely keep the tension. What I should have done was take on e5 first, and then after d takes e5, just play any reasonable knight move here, like knight e2 or knight g2. And then the point here is that if black ever pushes e4, I can jump back with knight to f4, and structurally I think white still has a good position. Instead, I played knight d3, just trying to get my opponent to take twice on d4. I felt like if black takes here, and then let's say e takes d4, then I could play rook e1, for example, and queen takes a7 next, followed by queen takes b6, and black's pawns are going to be left pretty weak. Instead, he ends up kind of blundering on the spot with the move f4, probably as a result of just being under pressure. What black should have done was take once on d4, then after e takes d4, push e4. I think in this case, black would be holding a more solid structure. But after the move f4, black's idea is that if I take e takes f4, then he's going to be taking the d4 pawn, and then my bishop on b2 is kind of stuck. But of course I can play d takes e5 first, and this is what my opponent just kind of overlooked. I'm hitting the bishop, and then after d takes e5, now I'm taking on f4 and basically winning a pawn for free. So yeah, kind of an unfortunate blunder, but this was g60, so black didn't have a ton of time at this point. After takes, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, knight takes f4, it was basically a losing position. Now white is a pawn up, the king is safer, and black's 7th and 8th ranks in particular are going to be under a lot of pressure. In the next round, I was playing against National Master Pranav Nagarajan, and in this position, I had kind of aimed for this position where black has already sacrificed the pawn, and in this position it is black to play. I would love to grab this pawn on h3 and get my pawn back and get a lot of activity, but of course the knight on d6 is hanging. So I played the right move here, rook f c8, just kind of getting out of the pin and putting pressure on white's position. And white's issue here is, of course, that the lack of development is causing problems. The king doesn't really have a lot of safety right now, and if black can get some activity, white might just find themselves really overextended. So here my opponent plays bishop takes d6, which I think was very reasonable. And I actually considered the right idea here, but again, because this was a g60, I decided not to spend too much time calculating, and eventually I just made the simple recapture queen takes d6. But I totally underestimated the idea to first take on c1 before recapturing on d6, and after queen takes c1 to include another in-between move, rook to c8. Now the tactical point here is that if bishop c5, black is going to have bishop f8, winning back the piece, and then once the bishop comes out to c5, white's king is going to be extremely weak, and black is just going to have basically a winning attack. Instead, if white simply moves the queen away, then now after queen takes d6, what's happened is I've taken over the c-file, and in this position I think black has a lot more compensation than what I got in the game. Because here, even though we've traded some pieces, the remaining pieces on the board are heavily in black's favor. Now black can start dominating the c-file with rook c4, queen c5, rook c2, bishop coming out to f8, and eventually c5. And white is just not going to be able to be in time to get the king out before black's pieces kind of invade. So this was definitely a missed opportunity. After queen takes d6, knight to e3, I can no longer take on c1 and bring my rook to c8, so I'm not going to be able to win control over the c-file. I played the move bishop f8, king f2, queen d7, king g2. I think I had better options along the way here, but at this point my opponent basically just starts outplaying me. And I was only able to save this game thanks to a pretty fortunate resource. Here after queen e7, knight c4. At this point, white is just fully consolidated. He's now a pawn up, and black has basically no compensation. The only thing I can hope for is for my opponent to make a mistake. I played bishop d4, and now white plays f4, which is a really strong move. Just undermining the bishop on d4, hitting the pawn on e5, and black just doesn't really have a great response to this. I tried what I felt like was my only chance with the move h4. And the point is to fix this g3 square so that if my queen is ever able to get in, as you see by the arrows, then I'll have this g3 square to use for any potential counterplay. So he takes on e5. I think taking on playing f5 was maybe even stronger. I played bishop takes e5, and now d6. And at this point I realized that my intended move queen e6 is actually not so good. I was thinking if white takes on e5 here, queen takes e5, then my queen is going to be super active in this position, hitting all of these weaknesses in white's position, and white just wouldn't be able to defend everything. The b2 pawn is also kind of hanging. But at the last minute, I realized that after queen e6, my opponent is probably not going to take on e5, and instead is going to play queen d5, which is just a much stronger move, threatening to go into the endgame, hitting the bishop on e5, of course, eventually threatening to play knight b6, where I'll be forced to trade rooks on c1, white will play rook takes c1, and then quickly play d7 and rook to c8 and just promote the pawn. So as analyzing this endgame, I realized it was going to be extremely problematic for black. I started looking for other resources, but it seems like it's kind of too late, because now if queen e8, then it's just d7, and if queen d8, then the bishop on e5 is hanging. Eventually I found one final chance, and I decided to go for it, although during the game I felt like objectively it's probably not great, but just seemed like a good try. And that was the move bishop takes d6. So white has to take with the knight here. If queen takes d6, queen takes e4, the knight on c4 is just going to be lost. So white goes knight takes d6, rook takes c1, rook takes c1, and now rook to d8. So the point of the piece sacrifice is to kind of set up this annoying pin. White can defend the knight very easily with the moves either rook to d1 or rook to c6. But the point was, after rook d1, which was played in the game, was to play the move queen to e5 again, keeping an eye on the knight, but also threatening queen g3 check, as well as keeping an eye on the g5 pawn and the b2 pawn. And basically white's queen is kind of outstretched here and not able to defend all of these key squares. It's a really tough situation for white. During the game I felt like I'm at least going to have some kind of perpetual here, and I was hoping to make a draw. The computer points out that had white played rook to c6, this would have actually won the game, because after queen to e5 and king f3, another strong move, if black starts giving checks with queen g3, then white's king is actually going to be able to escape via the d1 square, something that's not possible if there's a rook on d1. But of course, finding this rook c6 move, I think, is not an easy task. So after the natural rook to d1, queen e5, I was basically able to create enough counterplay with queen g3, queen d3. I took on d6 here, and then after queen takes d6, queen f3 check, I just had an immediate perpetual. King g1, queen e3. If the king comes up to g2, I'll play queen e2 check, and basically white's king isn't able to get out. So I felt like I was pretty fortunate to actually save this game because I was clearly worse and losing at one point. But I'm happy that I was able to find this defensive resource, basically making it very hard for my opponent to actually finish and win the game. So like I mentioned, in round 3 I took a bye. In round 4, this was the first game with the full time control, which was 40 moves in 100 minutes, followed by 30 minutes sudden death after that with a 10-second delay. In this game, I'm now playing white in a King's Indian, and here black played the move knight to b4, introducing a very unpleasant threat of knight takes a2 check, and after knight takes a2, knight to b3, winning the queen. So I was basically deciding between two moves here, and that is the moves king to b1 and bishop takes c5. This might be a good moment to pause the video if you'd like to think for yourself and just choose between which of these two moves you think white should play. So I ended up going wrong here. I was definitely interested in bishop takes c5 because after d takes c5, if white can play knight to e4, then white is just going to be able to take control over the most important square in the position, shut down black's bishop on g7, and if white is able to also get a3 in, then black's knight is likely going to have to go back to a6, which is just going to be a really bad square, and white is just going to have a huge strategic advantage. What I just failed to realize is that in this position, at first glance, it just seemed like black was taking this pawn on a2 with check, and I kind of dismissed the line without really analyzing it further. So then I thought, well, why don't I take on c5, and then after dc, just play the move king to b1, because I want to defend the pawn, but of course the pawn on f2 is hanging. And if I don't defend the pawn on f2, I thought, well, I'm also running into bishop h6. And so this move seemed very annoying. So seeing all of these ideas and not working through them properly meant that I didn't realize actually that move by move, white is actually totally fine here. The point is after knight e4, of course I'm hitting the queen on f6, so black doesn't actually have time to take on a2 with check. I'm just going to play king to b1, and black has two pieces hanging and can't defend both of them. Normally this is very simple to calculate, but clearly something was just confusing for me in the calculation, and I ended up just completely overlooking this idea. Instead I thought, well, I have to deal with two threats now, rook takes f2 and bishop h6, and I didn't realize that knight e4 actually adequately deals with both of them. Once the queen moves somewhere, let's say even queen h4, I can throw in another in-between move with rook g4, so that the queen is not hitting the knight. And then after queen takes h3, for example, white can play a move like king to b1, followed by a3. The knight will have to go back, and white is just going to have an absolutely dominant strategic position here. Second rook coming to g1, and all of white's pieces just having really good squares. So not wanting to take on c5 right away, I decided to start with king to b1, basically threatening to take on c5 and then push a3 and knight e4 and just get this strategic grip. But now my opponent shocked me, and so this would be another time to pause the video if you'd like to stop and try to find the strongest move for black here. And yeah, I didn't miss the move that he played, but I completely didn't see the follow-up or didn't understand at first. And that was the move rook takes f2. So I definitely considered this move in my calculations because, of course, this is a very forcing move, and I thought, well, I should make sure that it doesn't just work for black. And what I felt was that after bishop takes f2, queen takes f2, rook takes g7, is that white should be able to get a pretty strong attack here. King takes g7, queen g5 check, king goes back, rook f1, and black is potentially going to get mated here with queen f6 and then rook g1 after that. Actually, I'm not even sure that this calculation was correct, because in this position, black can throw in queen f5 check, which is actually very annoying, and not letting me play queen to g5 check after king takes on g7 next. Nevertheless, all of that is irrelevant because after rook takes f2, Black's point is actually to meet bishop takes f2 with queen to f5 check immediately. So this is the idea that I completely forgot about, or I should say just missed. So bishop takes f2, now after queen f5 check. If I go back to c1, then again I'm running into knight takes a2, and here black is not just winning the queen, but actually winning the game. This is a pretty nice checkmate. And if I go king a1, well, this at first glance looked very scary because black gets knight c2 check, and I'm going to have to allow some kind of discovered attack, potential smothered mate, who knows what's going on here. Well, after recovering from the initial shock of rook takes f2, I started breaking down the lines and just trying to figure out what my best chance here, and I realized that actually I can get away with taking this rook. And then after queen f5 check, king a1, knight to c2. At first I was considering just giving up the queen here, but white doesn't really get enough material. It's just rook and minor piece, and black's queen is still really active. But then I realized I can actually just play king to b1, and because I'm up a whole rook, and I'm threatening to play bishop d3 to kind of shut down the attack, black's options are really limited here. Has to play either knight to b4 check and repeating the position, which doesn't allow bishop to d3, or black can try knight a3 check, which I think is a good try. If I play king a1, then black has nothing better than to just repeat. However, if I try to get fancy with king c1, as I was considering during the game, black doesn't have any immediate mates, but he does have the move bishop h6, which if I had missed this would have been a very unpleasant surprise. And here I think actually white is just losing because the queen has to stay in contact with the c2 square, otherwise I get mated, but of course bishop h6 makes that quite difficult. Instead, okay, after knight a3 check, I would just have to play king a1 and we would get a repetition. In the game, my opponent just played knight b4, king a1, knight c2, and we agreed to a draw. So the draw definitely wasn't a great result for me, because especially given that had I just found the right move here, I would have had a big advantage. But I was pretty happy not to have lost the game after missing a combination that I probably should have been anticipating ahead of time. So I was fortunate that this isn't just straight up winning for black. So in the next two rounds, I managed to bounce back in this game against another 2100 strong, kind of underrated junior. I was playing black here. It's another King's Indian. Here I played the move knight to h5, which I think was not the best move, but okay, was thematic and a reasonable idea. And it ends up provoking my opponent to playing the move g4. So clearly his idea was that if I continue with knight to f4, then he's just going to be able to take a pawn, and if I go back knight f6, then white has won some time. But honestly, this move g4 just comes at such a huge cost to the king's side that I felt like this was a pretty dubious idea. After some calculation, I figured, okay, I should just go ahead and play knight f4. I'm usually willing to sacrifice this pawn even if white hasn't played g4 and hasn't weakened the king side, so I felt like certainly this should be kind of a good version of things. He ends up taking on f4, queen takes f4, I play knight to c5, and this is kind of the problem for white, is that actually black is immediately threatening to win back the pawn with bishop takes c3 and then knight takes e4. This kind of pushes him to play e5 and hold on to the pawn for a little bit longer, but after knight d7, black is just winning back the pawn anyway. So this was almost not even a sacrifice, because I think just with direct active moves, black was able to win back the pawn. And here after rook fe1, knight takes e5, I've gotten the pawn back and I've gotten white's dark squared bishop, so now black has the advantage of the two bishops. The game continued bishop f1, knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3. I played queen to d8. White got another tempo with rook a d1. I played queen to a5. And at first it might seem like white has a pretty reasonable position. I mean, at least everything is developed. But the problem is that black's dark squared bishop in particular is just a very powerful piece. The light squared bishop is also going to be pretty good on the e6 square. White has made some long-term weaknesses for the future, both on the queen side and on the king side. And yeah, the extra development just doesn't really materialize into anything here for white, whereas black has this kind of long-term strategic advantage. So he plays a3, I go bishop e6, rook e3, and I was pretty happy with my technique here. I basically opted to trade off a couple of heavy pieces, just trying to leave myself with some kind of endgame with two bishops versus bishop and knight, and I was able to do exactly that. I know a lot of players would strongly be considering to just take on c3 in this kind of position and leave white with these very ugly double pawns. During the game, I felt like for sure black is going to be better here in this endgame, but I felt like there was no need to do this right away, and that it was stronger just to keep the bishop for as long as I could, and not cash in too early if I didn't have to. Instead, I just played this move queen to e5, which just kind of keeps the tension all over the board. White ends up playing queen d6 and going for the endgame, and I was very happy to play this position because I just felt like black has a number of small advantages, the two bishops, better structure, and then this is enough to play for the win in the long run. So I ended up winning this game. My technique was not too fancy. I just pushed f5, I pushed h5, I tried to provoke white into creating more weaknesses. I tried to open some lines for my pieces, and eventually white's position just kind of collapsed. He wasn't able to hold on to all of his pawns. I felt like my next game, which was round 6, was also pretty instructive. Here I was playing black, and although the position kind of resembles a King's Indian, it actually came from the English opening, 1c4, where I opted for symmetrical English as a response. And so I felt like I had done pretty well in this position. Here I have the knight on d4. That's a pretty strong piece. It's very difficult for white to dislodge the knight. If he makes a move like b5 or something, then I'm first going to take on e2 with check, and then the second knight is going to jump into d4. Instead, my opponent played queen to d2, and it feels like white's position is totally fine here. I mean, he does have quite a bit of space. But the problem for white is that he actually lacks a pretty reasonable plan. Any further advance is going to just result in further weaknesses. So I tried to provoke my opponent a little bit. I started with this move, king to h8. It seems like a nothing move, but I'm just trying to improve my position very little by little. The idea is to set up an eventual f5 break, and I felt like, okay, my king will be slightly safer on h8. And it kind of works, because here white played the move g4, which I felt like was just giving black a little bit more firepower for the eventual counterattack. So I immediately play f5. And now any kinds of trades here are going to be, I think, in my favor. For example, if g takes f5, I can consider taking with either pawn. If white keeps taking, then eventually I'll probably take with a piece and leave white with some weaknesses, leaving the pawn on e6 to cover the d5 square. Instead, my opponent kept the tension with h3, which I think was probably the best move given the circumstances. I played rook ae8, just another kind of quiet improving move, and waiting to see what white is going to do. If he continued to shuffle, at some point I might even push e5 and try to strike back in the center, also opening up my queen against the g4 pawn. But here he ends up kind of continuing to go down the path of like overextending and messes up. He plays b takes c5, and I think this is already a huge mistake, because after dc, white has now allowed me to open up the d-file, and the d3 pawn is going to be a pretty big target here. I'm going to happily switch back to d8, and yeah, this d3 pawn is going to be very uncomfortable for white to defend. So he pushes e5. I think this was his planned follow-up, and positionally it kind of makes sense. I mean, he's opening up the bishop, he's closing down my bishop, but the problem is that these bishops on the diagonal are just going to get traded off very, very quickly, and eventually white is just going to be left with light squared weaknesses around his king. So I immediately played knight takes e2 check, knight takes e2, and rook to d8. The reason I traded first was I felt if I play rook to d8, white might actually avoid the trade with a move like knight to g3, where my knight on d4 would look nice, but wouldn't actually have anywhere to go. So I trade first, I go rook to d8, and here white plays rook fd1. This was kind of the losing move. At this point, what he should have done was actually just keep the king side closed with a move like g5. This would avoid the counterplay that I get in the game. And the tactical point is that if I actually take this pawn on d3, then at the end of it, he can go ahead and play bishop takes c5, taking advantage of the fact that my bishop on b7 is hanging. And here, after something like rook c8, white is supposedly okay according to Stockfish, but I still felt like after a quick bishop f8 that black is going to have decent chances in this position. Instead, he defends the pawn here with rook fd1, but this kind of leaves the king side exposed. I take this opportunity to play f takes g4, h takes g4, and now g5. Just undermining white's pawns. This is a pretty thematic idea, especially in things like the French defense, where black is often fighting against the space advantage. And here white just has no way of holding on to the structure. If he plays a move like bishop to e4, as happens in the game, I'm just taking on f4 here, and the e5 pawn is falling. I actually could have played this g5 move earlier in the game. The Stockfish were saying it was winning earlier on, but okay, I ended up playing it just in time to keep a big advantage here. And after bishop takes f4, knight takes e5, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7. Black was up a pawn here, and white's king was just left without any protection. I was able to win very quickly. So in the final game, I was paired against Grandmaster Stukopin, who's quite a strong player, and I had actually misplayed the opening with white. I didn't really get what I was looking for, and I felt like I was slightly worse right from the get-go. In this position here, it seems like things are approximately equal, but in my opinion, I think black has slightly the more comfortable game. Apparently, according to Stockfish, I could have equalized more or less with the move rook to d1, just trying to trade rooks, but I just felt like I was going to be slightly worse in this position. I wanted to defend in, let's say, a slightly more active way, so I played the move knight to d4. And the idea of this move is to kind of eye the c6 square. Now whenever black tries a move like knight to e4, he's going to have to worry about me trading at least once on e4, and then playing a move like knight to c6, which could be annoying. Instead, my opponent reacted in a better way. He starts with queen a8, targeting the g2 pawn, kind of provoking me to play f3, which I was semi-okay with doing. And now he plays a really interesting move, g6. So this move looks very counterintuitive, but I think it's quite strong. It's shutting down the light-squared bishop, opening up the dark-squared bishop on the other hand, but it's very hard for white to take advantage of this diagonal for the time being, and he's setting up the move e5, where of course I wouldn't be able to meet this with knight to f5, and in fact my knight on d4 doesn't have a lot of great squares. So I went into the tank here trying to deal with these problems. I think I came up with a reasonable solution. I start with b4, kicking his knight back, knight d7, a3, and the point is not just to defend the b4 pawn, but also to improve my bishop with bishop a2, especially if black is going to be pushing e5 soon. He starts with knight b6, bishop a2, and now comes e5. I play knight to c2 here, and I actually wasn't sure what he was going to play in this position. It definitely feels like white is a little bit passive, and black has potential activity here, but it's actually not so easy for black to come up with something. For instance, if he plays the move knight to c4, I'm pretty sure I can just get away with taking twice on c4, because a move like rook to d2 feels very active, can be met with knight to b1, which I was anticipating during the game, and just kicking the rook out and leaving white with an extra pawn. According to Stockfish, the strongest move was knight to h5, which was not really on my radar during the game. I mean, this is a thematic move in this type of position, especially once I've played f3 and h3 and I've weakened the g3 square, but I didn't really anticipate the strength of this move during the game, and I guess my opponent didn't really estimate it properly either. Instead, he plays e4, which, okay, is very logical. He's trying to open up the diagonal, or if I push f4, then he's going to secure the d3 square for his rook. But the problem for black is that after I take on e4, and then I take and bishop takes, yes, my pawn on e3 is left very, very weak, and I think this is what my opponent was playing against. But fortunately, I have enough play on the diagonals now to cause some counterplay and some grief for my opponent. So I start with knight d4 here, again eyeing the c6 square. Black plays rook to c8, trying to take over the c-file and eventually plug things up with knight to c4. But it turns out he's not really in time. Rook c8, queen takes c8, and I found queen f2 here, which I think was the most accurate way. Not just hitting the f7 pawn, but threatening to activate with moves like queen f4, queen e5, queen h6, and so on, and finally taking advantage of some of the potential weaknesses around black's kingside. So he goes knight c4, and now I just continue my plan queen f4, which I think concretely was working quite well in this position. The point is, of course, I'm keeping an eye on the f7 pawn, so if he takes on b2, then queen takes f7 is going to be leading to big problems for black, especially after king h8, queen takes e7, and I'm threatening to mate him as well as taking the bishop on e4. And if he plays a move like bishop to d5 here, just kind of keeping the bishop alive, then he's still not really threatening to take on b2 as the bishop on d5 is hanging, and so I have different options here. I can consider playing queen h6, In some lines I can consider even taking and then playing queen to e5 and then setting up again potential mates on g7 and h8. So I think objectively black is probably okay here, but during the game I think it's understandable that this would look quite scary for black. Instead he plays the move bishop to d6, which kind of invites a lot of complications. Now I was mainly considering queen takes e4 here, and then after knight takes b2. Black's point is that he's now threatening queen c1 check, king f2, and then a move like knight to d1 check or queen to d2, and this feels quite annoying. But I was very strongly considering to play bishop takes f7 here. And I think concretely it does work. Eventually I just talked myself out of it. The point is after king takes f7, queen d5 check, black doesn't really have a great way out. If he plays king to g7, I'm just going to take on d6, then queen c1 check, king h2, black can take the pawn back, but with white to play, only white can be better in this position, especially after knight e6, which already just looks kind of annoying for black to deal with. So I wasn't worried about this line, and after king e7, white can basically force a draw with knight c6 check, king d7, and knight e5 check. Because if the king moves to c7, I'll have queen c6, and then grabbing the bishop with check. Otherwise, black has to repeat with king e7, and after knight c6, we just have a draw by repetition. So I saw this line, and I was ready to go for it, but then at the last moment, I noticed that after bishop takes f7, in fact, maybe black can play a move like king to g7 or king f8, and this felt very annoying to me, because now he's still threatening this queen c1, which feels unpleasant, and if I play a move like knight to e6 check, well then this ruins my coordination, and now black can play king takes f7 without worrying about this perpetual. So I wasn't exactly sure. It turns out that this was not right for me to worry about. After the move bishop to b3, I basically just didn't look far enough. Queen c1 check, king f2. If black plays queen d2 check, knight d1 is of course nicely covered by the bishop. After queen d2, king to f3, black actually runs out of checks, and so I just didn't realize this during the game. And so if he went for this, then in this position he would just be losing or close to losing. Instead, black would have to take on f7 and just kind of accept the draw. But I wasn't sure during the game. I ended up going for my second option here, which is queen f6. And I felt like this also leads to a drawn position, though not in such a forcing way. Black played bishop e5. This is what I was expecting. Queen to e7. Now threatening to take on c4 and then grab one of black's bishops. Black plays queen f8, which I was also expecting. And now I don't have time to take on c4, but I can trade queens, take on c4, and then play the move knight to e6 check. Otherwise, it feels like white might be slightly worse. But after knight e6, I'm able to trade off another pair of pieces and end up with endgame with opposite color bishops. So king e7, bishop takes e5, king takes e6, bishop d4. This all happened in the game. And at first I was actually a little bit worried that I'd walked into some kind of bad endgame here, because black does have some advantages and he does have this passed c-pawn. But ultimately the stereotype of the drawish nature of opposite color bishop endgames kind of paid off here. And black has some tries but no way to win. He played bishop c6, king f2, h5, g3, king d5, h4. Typically the side that is defending, or the weaker side, should try to put all of their pawns on the same color as the bishop so that the bishop can protect them. And after king e4 he offered a draw, basically realizing he doesn't have any serious winning chances here. After I play the move king to e2, he's not really able to get in and cause problems. Now he can, let's say, play the move bishop to d7 and force my king to move, but unfortunately for black it doesn't really end up going anywhere. I'll just play king to d2, and if black plays king f3, then the bishop can come to e5, sit on f4, white's king will come on c3, and basically black won't be able to make any progress. So in view of this, he decided to just offer a draw, and that was the end of the game. So yeah, I finished with 5 points out of 7, 3 wins, 3 draws, and 1 bye. My USCF rating went up by like 2 points, so it wasn't a fantastic result in terms of the rating. But I think given the FIDE ratings of most of my opponents are probably lower than their USCF, I have a feeling that I'm not going to be gaining much FIDE rating after this tournament. But that's okay. It was a good experience. A lot of the games were really interesting. For the most part, I'm pretty happy with how I played. I feel like I had a pretty solid style, and I didn't make any particularly egregious blunders. I would say the biggest mistake I made was in the third game that I showed in the King's Indian, where I played the move king to b1 instead of taking the knight on c5, and this move king b1 was walking into the tactics with rook takes f2 and queen f5 check and all of those ideas. Other than that, I don't think I had any particularly huge misses, but still some area for improvement. There were definitely some moments where I could have played more accurately. Alright guys, hope you found this video instructive. If you did, please do let me know and leave a like on the video. It really helps the channel a lot, and I'll see you next time. Take care.